Professor Richard Harmon walked into the lecture hall with the same confident stride he'd perfected over 15 years of teaching. His leather shoes clicked against the polished floor as he placed his worn briefcase on the desk. The advanced, Calculus 401 class fell silent. Even the students who had been chatting in the back rows straightened up and closed their mouths. Professor Harmon's reputation preceded him. "Welcome to Advanced Calculus," he said, his voice filling the room without effort. He didn't smile. He never smiled on the first day. "Some of you are here because you love mathematics. Some of you are here because you need this credit for your engineering or physics degree. And some of you," his eyes scanned the room slowly, "are here because you think a math class is an easy grade." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd of 60 students. Professor Harmon didn't join in. "Let me be clear," he continued, turning to write his name on the whiteboard in precise, angular letters. "By the end of this semester, at least a third of you will have dropped this course. Another third will barely pass. The remaining students, those who truly belong here, will thrive." He turned back to face the silent room. "I don't waste my time on students who can't keep up." In the back row, Maylin shifted in her seat. She'd chosen the spot deliberately, far enough from the professor's direct gaze but with a clear view of the board. She was 23, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a gray sweater that seemed one size too large. Nothing about her stood out in the crowd of students, which was exactly how she preferred it. May opened her notebook, uncapped her pen, and began taking notes as Professor Harmon launched into his introduction to the course. Her handwriting was neat and small, filling the margins with additional thoughts and connections that came to her as he spoke. "Now," Professor Harmon said, clapping his hands together after outlining the syllabus, "let's see what we're working with this semester." His thin lips curved into what might have been a smile but looked more like a predator baring its teeth. "Pop quiz." The room filled with groans. "Nothing to worry about if you've done the preparatory reading I emailed last week," he said, though his tone suggested he knew many hadn't. "This won't be graded, but it will give me an idea of who's serious about mathematics and who's wasting my time." Professor Harmon began writing a series of calculus problems on the board, each one more complex than the last. May's eyes widened slightly as she recognized the final problem. It went well beyond introductory material. She bent over her notebook, working through each step carefully. Around her, she could hear the scratching of pencils, frustrated sighs, and the occasional whispered curse. After 15 minutes, Professor Harmon turned back to the class. "Time's up. Let's see what you've managed to do." His eyes scanned the room, looking for a victim. His gaze fell on a young man in the front row who had been confidently working throughout the exercise. "You, in the blue shirt. Show me your solution to the first problem." The student stood and recited his answer, which was correct. Professor Harmon nodded curtly and moved on to another student for the second problem. This continued until he reached the final, most difficult problem. His eyes traveled to the back of the room where May sat quietly reviewing her work. Something about her lack of visible stress irritated him. Most students looked nervous, but she seemed almost peaceful. "You, in the back, gray sweater." Professor Harmon pointed directly at May. "What's your name?" May looked up, momentarily startled at being addressed. "May Lin, sir." "Ms. Lin, please share your solution to the final problem." 60 pairs of eyes turned to look at her. May felt her cheeks grow warm. She hated being the center of attention. She began, her voice barely audible. "Speak up, Ms. Lin. We can't hear you in the back," Professor Harmon said, crossing his arms. May took a deep breath. "I think the answer is the limit approaches. Infinity as x approaches 0 from the positive direction," she said, her voice still soft but clearer. "But there's a discontinuity that needs to be addressed with L'Hopital's rule when—" "And did you verify that?" Professor Harmon interrupted, his eyebrows raised. "Yes, I did the second derivative test and—" "Show your work, Ms. Lin. Come to the board." A flash of panic crossed May's face. Walking to the front of the class felt like crossing an ocean. She could feel everyone watching as she made her way down the steps of the lecture hall, her notebook clutched tightly to her chest. Professor Harmon handed her a marker and stepped aside, giving her the floor. May stared at the blank whiteboard, her hand trembling slightly. "We're waiting, Ms. Lin," Professor Harmon said, checking his watch. "Though perhaps you'd prefer to sit down if you're not prepared?" Something in his tone, the barely disguised hope that she would fail, steadied May's hand. She uncapped the marker and began writing. Her characters small at first, then growing more confident as the equations flowed from her mind to the board. Professor Harmon watched with narrowed eyes as she worked through the problem. He'd chosen it specifically because it required a thorough understanding of calculus fundamentals, plus some creative thinking. Most first-year graduate students would struggle with it. When May finished and stepped back from the board, there was a moment of silence. Professor Harmon examined her work, looking for errors. Finding none in the main solution, he pointed to a small notation in the corner. "And what's this, Ms. Lin? An alternative approach?" May nodded, her eyes fixed on her shoes. "Yes, sir. I thought there might be a more elegant way to solve it using a substitution, but I wasn't sure if it would work in all cases." Professor Harmon's mouth tightened. Her alternative method was valid, creative even. But instead of acknowledging this, he simply said, "Incomplete work, Ms. Lin. If you're going to suggest an alternative solution, you should be prepared to prove it thoroughly." May's shoulders slumped slightly. "Yes, Professor, I'm sorry." "You may sit down." As May returned to her seat, whispers followed her. She kept her eyes on the floor, her face burning with embarrassment. What the other students didn't see was the small, satisfied smile that briefly crossed Professor Harmon's face. He'd found his target for the semester. For the remainder of the class, Professor Harmon outlined his expectations for the course. Weekly problem sets, 2 midterms, a comprehensive final exam, and a research project. Each requirement sounded more demanding than the last. "Any questions?" he asked as the class period neared its end. When no one raised their hand, he nodded once. "Good. First problem set is due Friday. Don't be late." As students packed up their belongings, Professor Harmon called out, "Ms. Lin, a word before you leave." May froze, then slowly made her way to the front of the now emptying classroom. She stood before his desk, clutching her notebook like a shield. "Your work today was interesting," Professor Harmon said, organizing papers into his briefcase, without looking at her. "Thank you, sir," May whispered. That wasn't a compliment. Now he looked up, fixing her with a cold stare. "I've taught advanced mathematics for 15 years, Ms. Lin. I can spot a student who has memorized solutions without understanding the underlying principles." May's eyes widened. "But I didn't. Friday's problem set will show me what you're really capable of," he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "I expect original work, not regurgitated textbook examples. Is that clear?" "Yes, Professor," May said quietly, though confusion and hurt flickered across her face. "You may go." May turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the empty lecture hall. As she pushed open the heavy door, she glanced back. Professor Harmon was already absorbed in his papers, having dismissed her from his thoughts. Outside in the hallway, May leaned against the wall and took a deep breath. She'd chosen this university specifically for its mathematics program, saving for years to afford the tuition. Now, on her very first day, the department's most influential professor had decided she didn't belong. What Professor Harmon didn't know, what nobody at the university knew, was that mathematics wasn't just a subject May studied. It was the language through which she understood the world. Since childhood, numbers and equations had made sense when little else did. While other kids played games, May had filled notebooks with patterns and proofs. She straightened her shoulders and walked toward the library. If Professor Harmon wanted original work, she would give him original work. She just needed to find the courage to show what she was truly capable of, something she'd been hiding for years. What May didn't realize was that Professor Harmon had already decided who she was. Just another student to break. He had no idea. He had just challenged someone who could rewrite the rules of his own game. By the end of the second week, everyone in Advanced Calculus 401 knew the pattern. Professor Harmon would begin each class with a complex problem on the board, and inevitably, his eyes would find Mei Lin in the back row. "Ms. Lin," he would say, his voice carrying a hint of anticipation, "please demonstrate the solution." Today was no different. The lecture hall hummed with nervous energy as students settled into their seats. Mei had started coming 15 minutes early to secure the same spot in the back corner. Not that it helped her avoid attention. "Good morning," Professor Harmon said, though there was nothing warm in his greeting. He wrote an equation on the board, the marker squeaking against the glossy surface. "Let's begin with a refresher from last class." Mei's eyes traced the problem, her mind already breaking it down into manageable pieces. It was a partial differential equation with boundary conditions, trickier than usual for a warm-up. "Ms. Lin," Professor Harmon called out right on cue, "please explain the approach you would take." Mei stood up slowly. 2 weeks of this treatment had taught her that hesitation only made things worse. "I would use separation of variables," she said, her voice soft but steady. "Since the boundary conditions are homogeneous, we can—" "Speak up, Ms. Lin," Professor Harmon interrupted. "The class can't hear your mumbling." A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The professor's targeting of the quiet girl in the back had become obvious to everyone, and it made many of them uneasy. Mei cleared her throat and raised her voice. "We can separate the variables and find the eigenvalues to construct a solution. As an infinite series." Professor Harmon's eyebrows rose slightly. "And how would you determine if this series converges?" "The eigenvalues grow quadratically," Mei answered without hesitation. "So the coefficients in the series will decrease faster than 1 over n squared, which guarantees convergence by the comparison test." A flicker of annoyance crossed Professor Harmon's face. He had hoped to trip her up with that follow-up question. "Come to the board and show your work," he commanded. This had become routine as well. Mei would walk down to the front, aware of the eyes following her, and work through the problem under Professor Harmon's scrutinizing gaze. Today, however, something different happened. As Mei carefully wrote out the solution, Professor Harmon stood uncomfortably close, examining each line as it appeared. When she finished the main calculation and began adding a note about an alternative approach, he cleared his throat loudly. "What are you doing, Ms. Lin?" Mei's hand froze mid-equation. "I'm showing another way to think about the problem. If we view it as a—" "Did I ask for alternative solutions?" His voice was sharp. "No, but I thought—" "That's precisely the issue," Professor Harmon said, taking the marker from her hand. "You're overthinking simple problems while missing the fundamentals." Mei blinked in confusion. "I don't understand. The solution is correct. Is it?" Professor Harmon turned to the class. "Can anyone spot the error in Ms. Lin's work?" The room fell silent as 60 pairs of eyes scrutinized the whiteboard. After an uncomfortable minute, a student in the front row hesitantly raised his hand. "There's no error in the math, Professor. Her solution looks complete." Professor Harmon's mouth tightened into a thin line. "The error," he said, circling a perfectly valid step in Mei's work, "is in the approach. Ms. Lin has chosen an unnecessarily complicated method that obscures the elegant simplicity of calculus. It was a criticism that made no mathematical sense, and everyone knew it." Mei stared at the circled equation, bewildered. "Return to your seat, Ms. Lin," Professor Harmon said dismissively, "and see me after class." As Mei walked back up the steps, a boy named Tyler whispered, "That was brutal," as she passed his row. She gave him a small, grateful nod. For the remainder of the class, Professor Harmon pointedly called on other students, praising their much simpler, and sometimes incorrect, solutions. Mei took notes silently, her pen moving steadily across the page despite the knot in her stomach. When class ended, she approached his desk as instructed. Professor Harmon waited until the last student had left before speaking. "Ms. Lin, your performance in this class concerns me." Mei looked up in surprise. She had aced the first problem set and answered every question correctly in class, despite his attempts to fluster her. "I don't understand, Professor. My work—" "Your work," he interrupted, "shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what mathematics is about. It's not about showing off with complicated solutions. I wasn't trying to show off, May said quietly. Those approaches just make sense to me. Professor Harmon leaned back in his chair, studying her. Where did you complete your undergraduate studies? Community college in California. Then I transferred to State University to finish my degree. Something like satisfaction flickered across his face. I see. Well, the standards here are considerably higher. At this university, we value clarity and elegance over unnecessarily complex derivations. May swallowed hard. I'll try to simplify my approach. See that you do. Your midterm is in 2 weeks. It will determine whether you belong in this program. The implied threat hung in the air between them. May nodded once and turned to leave. One more thing, Ms. Lin, Professor Harmon called after her. I'll be assigning presentation topics tomorrow. You'll be presenting the section on advanced integration techniques. May froze. Public speaking was her greatest fear. Professor, is there a problem? His tone dared her to object. No, she whispered. No problem. Outside the classroom, May leaned against the wall, taking deep breaths to calm herself. She jumped when someone touched her shoulder. Hey, you okay? It was Tyler from class, his freckled face creased with concern. I'm fine, May said automatically. No, you're not. That guy is targeting you and everyone can see it. Tyler shook his head. Have you thought about filing a complaint? May looked horrified at the suggestion. I can't do that. He's the department chair. Besides, he hasn't done anything wrong technically. Except publicly humiliate you for being too good at math, Tyler pointed out. Look, a few of us are getting together at the library to study for the midterm. You should join us. May hesitated. She always studied alone. It was safer that way. No one to judge her, no one to realize how her mind worked differently. I don't know. Just think about it, Tyler said, handing her a scrap of paper with his phone number. Basement level of the library, study room C, tonight at 7. After Tyler left, May walked slowly across campus toward her small apartment. The autumn air was crisp, leaves crunching beneath her feet. She had come to this university with such hope, saving for years while working at her parents' small grocery store to afford the tuition. Now, just 2 weeks in, she was the target of a professor who seemed determined to break her. Back in her apartment, May opened her laptop and stared at the blank document titled Presentation, Advanced Integration Techniques. The cursor blinked mockingly at her. Public speaking had always been her weakness. In high school, she'd once fainted during an oral report. In college, she'd chosen classes specifically to avoid presentations. Her phone chimed with a text from her mother. How is school going? Are you eating enough? May typed back. Everything is fine. Classes are interesting. She couldn't tell her parents the truth. They had sacrificed too much for her to be here. Her father had taken a second job. Her mother had sold her prized jade necklace, a family heirloom. Our daughter, the mathematician. They'd told everyone proudly. May closed her eyes, remembering the small room at the back of their grocery store where she'd spent countless hours with her notebooks, exploring the patterns and relationships. That made sense to her when little else did. Math had been her sanctuary, her private joy. Now Professor Harmon was turning it into a weapon against her. She opened her eyes and looked at the crumpled paper with Tyler's number. Maybe studying with others wasn't such a bad idea. At least she wouldn't be alone. As the afternoon light faded into evening, May made a decision. She would not let Professor Harmon drive her away. She'd worked too hard to get here. She gathered her books, tucked her hair behind her ears, and headed out toward the library. What she didn't know was that across campus, in a well-appointed office, Professor Harmon was reviewing her file again, puzzled by something he couldn't quite put his finger on. There was something about May Lin's work that nagged at him, something familiar in her approaches that he couldn't place. He closed the folder with a snap. It didn't matter. In his 15 years of teaching, he'd never failed to identify the students who didn't belong. And in his mind, May Lin definitely didn't belong. He had no idea how wrong he was. The university, Library basement was quiet except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional turning of pages. In study room C, May sat with Tyler and 3 other students from their calculus class. Their books and notes spread across the large table, coffee cups and snack wrappers scattered between stacks of paper. So that's why you have to use the chain. Rule here, Tyler was explaining to Lisa, a biology major who was struggling with the latest problem set. It's like opening nested boxes. You have to unwrap one function at a time. May watched silently, impressed by Tyler's patience and clear explanations. She'd been coming to these study sessions for a week now, but mostly she just listened and occasionally corrected a mistake. Speaking up in front of even this small group made her palms sweat. May, said Priya, an engineering student with bright eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. You've been quiet. What do you think about problem 6? I can't figure out where to start. All eyes turned to May, who felt her chest tighten. Well, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. It's a multivariable optimization problem with constraints. Right. But what method should we use? Asked David, pushing his glasses up, his nose. May took a deep breath. These people had been kind to her. They didn't laugh when she stumbled over words or needed time to compose her thoughts. She could do this. Lagrange multipliers, she said, a bit louder. She pulled the problem set toward her and picked up a pencil. Look, we set up the Lagrangian function like this. For the next 10 minutes, May walked them through the solution, gaining confidence with each step. When she finished, Priya let out a low whistle. That was amazing. I've been stuck on that for hours. Tyler grinned at May. See? You're a natural. Teacher. May blushed and looked down at her hands. Not really. I just understand the math. Which is exactly why your presentation is going to be great, Lisa said encouragingly. The mention of her upcoming presentation sent a wave of anxiety through May. Professor Harmon had assigned her the most technical topic, and she had less than a week to prepare. Just thinking about standing in front of 60 students while Professor Harmon waited for her to fail made her feel sick. I don't know, she murmured. I'm not good at public speaking. Nobody's born good at it, David said, matter-of-factly. It's a skill you learn like anything else. We can help you practice. May looked up surprised. You would do that? Of course, Tyler said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. That's what friends do. Friends. The word warmed. Something inside May that had been cold for a long time. She'd always been the odd one out. Too quiet, too absorbed in mathematics to make close connections. But here, in this basement room with its buzzing lights and coffee-stained table, she'd found people who seemed to accept her. Okay, she said with a small smile. I could use the help. As the night grew later, the study group packed up their things, agreeing to meet again tomorrow to help May with her presentation. Walking back to her apartment, May felt lighter than she had in weeks, despite the looming challenges ahead. The next morning, May arrived early to the calculus lecture, settling into her usual spot. She was reviewing her notes when a voice interrupted her thoughts. Ms. Lin, a word, please. Professor Harmon stood at the door of the lecture hall, beckoning her with a crooked finger. Heart sinking, May gathered her things and made her way down. To him. Come with me, he said without explanation, turning on his heel and walking briskly down the hallway. May hurried to keep up, anxiety building with each step. They entered the mathematics department office where Professor Harmon led her past the receptionist's desk and through a door marked Faculty Only. Inside was a conference room where an older woman with silver-streaked hair sat reviewing papers. Dr. Wright, Professor Harmon said. This is the student I mentioned. The woman looked up, her keen eyes studying May over the top of her reading glasses. May Lin, she said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Please sit down. May perched nervously on the edge of a chair, wondering what she had done wrong. Was she being reported for some violation? Was she about to be removed from the program? I've been reviewing your work, Dr. Wright said, tapping a folder in front of her. Quite impressive. Thank you. May whispered, confused by the compliment. Professor Harmon cleared his throat. Dr. Wright is the head of the graduate committee. She has some questions about your background. The way he said it made it sound like an accusation. May's hands twisted in her lap. Ms. Lin, Dr. Wright began, your solutions to Professor Harmon's problem sets show a sophisticated understanding of calculus that goes beyond undergraduate training. Where did you study before coming here? I started at Westlake Community College, May said, her voice small. Then I transferred to California State to finish my degree. And who were your mathematics professors there? Dr. Chen for most of my advanced courses and Dr. Patel for real analysis. Dr. Wright nodded, making a note. And have you published any papers or done research work? May hesitated, feeling Professor Harmon's eyes boring into her. I helped Dr. Chen with some research, but I wasn't officially credited. I see. Dr. Wright exchanged a glance with Professor Harmon that May couldn't interpret. Tell me, Ms. Lin, are you familiar with the work of Zhang Min? May felt her blood freeze. Zhang Min was the name she had published under, a slight rearrangement of her Chinese name that she had used for the 2 papers she'd written while working with Dr. Chen, papers that explored new approaches to solving certain classes of differential equations. I've read some of her work, May said carefully. Interesting, Dr. Wright said, leaning forward. Because her mathematical style is remarkably similar to yours. Almost identical, one might say. Professor, Harmon's expression turned triumphant. As I suspected, academic dishonesty is grounds for immediate dismissal from the program. What? May gasped, suddenly understanding the accusation. No, that's not. Ms. Lin, Dr. Wright interrupted, raising a hand. Are you Zhang Min? The question hung in the air. May looked from Dr. Wright's neutral expression to Professor Harmon's barely concealed satisfaction. She had kept her publication name separate from her academic identity for years, fearful of drawing attention to herself, of being thrust into the spotlight. Yes, she finally whispered. That's the name I published under. Professor, Harmon's triumphant look faltered. What? Dr. Wright's eyes sparkled with something that might have been amusement. I thought as much. Your paper on nonlinear differential equations was quite remarkable. We cited it in our department's recent publication. May stared at her hands. My advisor suggested using a different name. He said sometimes papers by women, especially Asian women, aren't taken as seriously. And I don't like attention. Dr. Wright nodded thoughtfully. A sad reality of our field, though one we're working to change. She turned to Professor Harmon. Well, Richard, it seems your student isn't plagiarizing after all. She's the original author. Professor Harmon's face had gone from triumphant to confused to something approaching anger. You should have disclosed this, he said to May. Hiding publications is deceptive. I didn't hide anything, May said, finding a small spark of courage. It's on my application. I listed the papers under additional information. I just didn't highlight it. Dr. Wright shuffled through the folder and pulled out May's application. So you did, she confirmed, showing a page to Professor Harmon. Right here. Professor Harmon scanned the page, his frown deepening. Nevertheless, this doesn't change the fact that Ms. Lin's performance in class has been inconsistent at best. Has it? Dr. Wright asked mildly. Her grades seem perfect. Grades. Don't tell the whole story, Professor Harmon insisted. She struggles with clear communication and lacks the confidence necessary for academic presentation. Ah, Dr. Wright said, turning back to May. Your presentation is coming up soon, isn't it? On advanced integration techniques? May nodded, her stomach clenching at the reminder. I look forward to attending, Dr. Wright said with a small smile. It's a fascinating topic. May's eyes widened in alarm. Another person to witness her inevitable humiliation. You're welcome to return to class, Ms. Lin, Dr. Wright said kindly. I believe it starts in 5 minutes. Professor Harmon and I have a few more things to discuss. Feeling dazed, May gathered her things and left the room. As the door closed behind her, she heard Dr. Wright's voice, suddenly less gentle. Richard, we need to talk about your treatment of promising students. May walked back to the lecture hall in a fog, barely noticing the other students filing in around her. Tyler waved from his seat, but May only managed a weak smile in return. What had just happened? Dr. Wright knew about her papers. She'd read them, even cited them. And now she was coming to May's presentation. As Professor Harmon entered the room, his face set in hard lines, May sank lower in her seat. Whatever Dr. Wright had said to him hadn't improved his mood. His eyes found May immediately, and the look he gave her made one thing clear. Nothing had changed. If anything, he seemed even more determined to see her fail. May opened her notebook with trembling hands. She had 5 days until her presentation. 5 days to overcome a lifetime of fear. 5 days to prove that she belonged here despite what Professor Harmon believed. In the back of her mind, a small voice whispered, "What if you just showed them what you can really do?" "Deep breaths," Tyler said, watching May pace back and forth. In the empty classroom they'd borrowed for practice. "You've got this." May stopped pacing long enough to shoot him a skeptical look. "I don't have anything. I'm going to freeze up and forget everything and then you'll take another breath and keep going," Priya interrupted firmly. "We've been through this 20 times. You know the material better than anyone." It was the night before May's presentation, and her friends had stayed late to help her prepare. The whiteboard was covered with equations and diagrams, and empty pizza boxes lay scattered on the desks. For 4 evenings straight, they'd listened to May practice, offering suggestions and encouragement as she slowly built her confidence. "Let's go through it one more time," David suggested, adjusting his glasses. "Start from the beginning." May nodded, took a deep breath, and faced her small audience. "Advanced integration techniques allow us to solve problems that can't be approached with elementary methods," she began, her voice steadier than it had been days ago. "Today I'll focus on 3 key approaches." As she moved through her presentation, explaining complex concepts with growing assurance, her friends nodded and smiled encouragingly. When she finished 20 minutes later, they broke into applause. "That was perfect," Lisa said, beaming. "Seriously, Professor Harmon won't know what hit him." May managed a small smile, though her stomach still churned with anxiety. "I don't know. What if I forget everything when I'm actually in front of the class? Then you'll look down at your notes and find your place again," Tyler said practically. "But you won't forget. You know this stuff in your sleep." As they packed up their things, Priya put a hand on May's shoulder. "Remember, we'll all be there tomorrow. Just look at us if you get nervous." May nodded gratefully. "Thank you, all of you. I never thought—" She paused, struggling to find the words. "I never thought I'd find friends like you here." "Well, get used to it," David said with a grin. "You're stuck with us now." Walking home under a sky scattered with stars, May felt a strange mix of terror and determination. Tomorrow would be a turning point, one way or another. Professor Harmon clearly expected her to fail. Dr. Wright would be watching too, though May couldn't guess what she expected. And somewhere in the back of her mind, that small voice still whispered, "Show them what you can really do." In her tiny apartment, May reviewed her notes one last time, then pulled out a separate notebook, one she hadn't shown anyone. Inside were pages of elegant equations and proofs, ideas she'd been developing for years. Her real work, not the simplified version she showed in class. For a long moment she stared at the complex mathematics that flowed across the page like poetry. Then she closed the notebook and put it away. Tomorrow, she would give the presentation as planned, clear, concise, and by the book. She wouldn't rise to Professor Harmon's bait. She wouldn't show off or try to impress Dr. Wright. She would simply do what was asked of her, nothing more and nothing less. With that decision made, May finally fell into a restless sleep. Morning came too quickly. May dressed carefully in her nicest sweater and slacks, reviewed her note cards one last time, and headed to class an hour early to set up. The lecture hall was empty and quiet, the morning sunlight streaming through tall windows. May wrote a few key equations on the board, then sat down to wait, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her fingertips. Students began filing. 30 minutes later, Tyler and the others gave her encouraging thumbs up as they took their seats. Then Professor Harmon arrived, his face impassive as he nodded curtly in her direction. And finally, just as class was about to begin, Dr. Wright slipped in through the back door and took a seat in the last row. "Good morning," Professor Harmon addressed the class. "Today, Ms. Lin will present on advanced integration techniques. I expect your full attention and questions afterward." He turned to May with a thin smile. "The floor is yours, Ms. Lin." May stood, her legs feeling like jelly as she made her way to the front of the room. 60 faces looked back at her, some interested, some already bored, some encouraging. She forced herself to take a deep breath. "Advanced integration techniques," she began, her voice a whisper. Someone in the back coughed. Professor Harmon frowned. "Louder, Ms. Lin," he said. "We can't hear you." May swallowed hard and tried again, forcing her voice to project. "Advanced integration techniques allow us to solve problems that can't be approached with elementary methods." "Better." She glanced at Tyler, who gave her a subtle nod. "Today I'll focus on 3 key approaches," she continued, gaining momentum. Integration by parts, trigonometric substitution, and partial fractions, decomposition. As she moved through her carefully prepared examples, May found herself relaxing slightly. The mathematics was like a familiar path through a forest. She knew every turn, every landmark. When she wrote equations on the board, her hand was steady. 15 minutes in, she was explaining a particularly tricky application when Professor Harmon interrupted. "Ms. Lin, your explanation of the partial fractions approach is incomplete. Would you care to elaborate on how this would apply to rational functions with repeated irreducible quadratic factors?" It was a deliberately advanced question, well beyond the scope of her assigned topic. May hesitated, glancing at her notes. This wasn't part of her prepared presentation. She looked up to see Professor Harmon watching her with that same expectant look, waiting for her to stumble. Behind him, Dr. Wright leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. Something shifted inside May. A quiet anger that had been building for weeks finally crystallized into resolve. Why was she holding back? Why was she letting this man dictate the boundaries of her knowledge? "Actually," she said, her voice suddenly clear and confident, "that's an excellent question, Professor." She put down her note cards and picked up a fresh marker. Without referring to any notes, she began to write a series of equations on the board, explaining as she went. "When we encounter repeated irreducible quadratic factors, we need to modify our approach. For each factor raised to a power m, we need a partial fraction term for each power from 1 to m." May's hand moved swiftly across the board, filling it with elegant mathematics. The class watched in stunned silence as she worked through the complex problem with obvious mastery, connecting it to theorems and concepts from advanced courses most of them hadn't taken yet. "This approach," she continued, unaware that her voice had grown stronger, "can be generalized to a broader class of functions using complex analysis techniques that I explored in my paper on." She caught herself, suddenly remembering where she was. The lecture hall was completely silent. Professor Harmon's face had gone from expectant to stunned to something like anger. In the back row, Dr. Wright was smiling broadly. "That is," May said, trying to rein herself back in, "these are more advanced applications that go beyond our current discussion." Professor Harmon cleared his throat. "Indeed they do, Ms. Lin. Perhaps you would be kind enough to return to the assigned topic?" But there was a new note in his voice, uncertainty, perhaps even a hint of respect, that hadn't been there before. May nodded and returned to her presentation, but something had changed. She stood straighter, she spoke clearly, and when she finished 20 minutes later and asked if there were any questions, several hands shot up. She answered each question thoughtfully, no longer hiding behind memorized responses but engaging with the material in a way that made her passion for mathematics clear to everyone in the room. When the last question had been answered, Professor Harmon stood up. "Thank you, Ms. Lin," he said stiffly. "That was informative." As students gathered their things and filed out, many of them stopped to compliment May. Tyler and the others surrounded her, bubbling with excitement. "That was amazing," Lisa gushed. "You completely owned it." "The look on Harmon's face when you started solving that impossible problem," David said, laughing. "I wish I'd taken a picture." May smiled, still processing what had happened. For the first time since she'd arrived at the university, she'd shown a glimpse of her true abilities, and it had felt wonderful. As her friends headed out to celebrate, May noticed Dr. Wright making her way toward the front of the room. Behind her, Professor Harmon was gathering his papers, his movements stiff and his expression unreadable. "Ms. Lin," Dr. Wright said warmly, "that was an exceptional presentation. I particularly enjoyed your impromptu extension into complex analysis. Applications. Thank you," May said, feeling her cheeks grow warm. "I'd like to speak with you about some research opportunities," Dr. Wright continued. "My team is working on problems that might benefit from your unique perspective." From the corner of her eye, May could see Professor Harmon listening intently, his back turned to them. "I'd like that," May said, surprised by her own boldness. As Dr. Wright left, promising to email details about a meeting, May found herself alone with Professor Harmon. An awkward silence stretched between them. "Your presentation exceeded expectations," he finally said, not quite looking at her. Coming from him, it was high praise indeed. May nodded, uncertain how to respond. "The midterm exam is tomorrow," he added, gathering his briefcase. "I expect you'll be well prepared." "Yes, Professor," May said, sensing that something fundamental had shifted in their dynamic. As Professor Harmon walked out, May remained in the empty lecture hall, letting the events of the morning sink in. She had faced her fear and found strength she didn't know she possessed. Tomorrow would bring the midterm, a new challenge, a new opportunity to prove herself. But for the first time, May wasn't afraid. Whatever problem Professor Harmon might throw at her, she would be ready. The morning of the midterm, the lecture hall hummed with nervous energy. Students flipped through notes and whispered formulas to each other, cramming in those last precious minutes of study time. May sat quietly in her usual spot, a strange calm having settled over her. After yesterday's presentation, something had changed, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. Tyler slid into the seat beside her, looking considerably less calm. "Ready for this?" he asked, running a hand through his already messy hair. May nodded. "I think so. How about you?" "As ready as I'll ever be. Thanks to your help with those practice problems." He gave her a nervous grin. "Still can't believe how you handled that curveball Harmon threw at you yesterday." The look on his face was priceless. Before May could respond, Professor Harmon entered the room, carrying a stack of papers. The chatter immediately died down. "Put away all notes and materials," he announced, his voice crisp and authoritative. "You have exactly 2 hours to complete this exam. Read the instructions carefully and show all your work for partial credit." As the exams were passed out, May took a deep breath and cleared her mind. Mathematics had always been her sanctuary, the place where the world made sense, where patterns revealed themselves to her like old friends. Today, she would embrace that fully. When the exam reached her, May scanned the first page and felt a small surge of confidence. The initial problems were straightforward applications of concepts they'd covered in class. She worked through them, methodically, showing each step clearly. By the halfway point of the exam, she'd reached the more challenging problems. These required creative thinking and the application of multiple techniques. May worked steadily, losing herself in the elegant dance of symbols and relationships. When she reached the final problem, however, she paused. It was unlike anything they'd seen in class, a complex, multivariable optimization with unusual constraints. She read it twice, then a third time, and then she recognized it. This wasn't just any problem. It was a famous unsolved problem in calculus, one that had been written about in journals and discussed at conferences. May had read about it in her independent studies. The mathematical community had been working on variations of this problem for years with only partial solutions proposed. She glanced up at Professor Harmon, who was watching the class from the front of the room. When his eyes met hers, She saw the challenge in them. He had included this problem knowing it was unsolvable by conventional means, a final attempt to put her in her place. May looked back at the problem, a strange excitement building inside her. Because the thing was, she had been thinking about this exact class of problems for the past 2 years. Her second paper, the one published under the name Jiangmin, had proposed a novel approach that might work here. For a moment, she considered just writing unsolvable by current methods and leaving it at that. It would be the safe choice. The expected choice. Instead, May turned to a fresh page and began to write. Her pencil moved swiftly as she outlined her approach, defining new variables and setting up a framework that transformed the problem. She worked with a quiet intensity, filling page after page with elegant mathematics. Time ticked by. Around her, students began turning in their exams and leaving. Tyler gave her a questioning look as he stood up, and she nodded that she was fine. Soon, only a handful of students remained, struggling with the later problems. 15 minutes remaining, Professor Harmon announced. May was on her final calculations now. She checked her work carefully, making sure each step was clear and justified. As she wrote the final line of her solution, a small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Time's up," Professor Harmon called. "Please bring your exams forward." May gathered her papers, double-checking that they were in order, and walked to the front of the room. Professor Harmon raised an eyebrow as she handed in her exam. "Finished everything, Ms. Lin?" he asked, a note of skepticism in his voice. "Yes, Professor," she replied quietly. "Including the last problem?" "Yes." Something flashed in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or disbelief. "I look forward to reading your solution." May nodded and turned to leave. As she walked out of the lecture hall, a weight seemed to lift from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, she had been true to herself and her abilities. Outside, her friends were waiting. "How'd it go?" Lisa asked anxiously. "I think it went well," May said, surprising herself with her confidence. "That last problem was impossible," David groaned. "I barely even understood what it was asking." "I just wrote down some equations and hoped for the best," Priya admitted. "What did you do with it, May?" May hesitated, not wanting to make her friends feel bad. "I tried an approach I've been thinking about for a while." Tyler studied her face. "You solved it, didn't you?" "I don't know if my solution is correct," May said carefully, "but I think my approach could work." Her friends exchanged looks of amazement. "Well," Tyler said finally, "I vote we all go get ice cream and not think about calculus for at least 24 hours. The suggestion was met with enthusiastic agreement, and as they walked across campus together, laughing and debating ice cream flavors, May felt a sense of belonging she'd never experienced before. 2 days later, May received an email asking her to come to Professor Harmon's office hours. Her friends offered to wait outside for moral support, but May told them it wasn't necessary. Whatever was coming, she could handle it on her own. Professor Harmon's office was exactly what she'd expected. Walls lined with mathematics texts, a blackboard covered in equations, papers stacked in neat piles. He looked up as she knocked on the open door. "Ms. Lin, come in." May sat in the chair across from his desk, back straight, hands folded in her lap. Professor Harmon studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I've finished grading the midterms," he said finally. "Most students performed as expected. A few did better than I anticipated. 1 or 2 did worse." May waited, heart beating steadily. Professor Harmon opened a folder and pulled out her exam. "Your performance on the standard problems was excellent, perfect scores across the board." "Thank you," May said quietly, "but it's your solution to the final problem that I wanted to discuss." He leaned forward, a new intensity in his gaze. "You do realize that was the Kirchhoff-Ramsey optimization problem? A problem that has stumped mathematicians for decades?" May nodded. "I recognized it. And yet, instead of acknowledging it as unsolvable, you produced 15 pages of work." He tapped her exam. 15 pages of the most innovative mathematics I've seen from a student in 20 years of teaching. May blinked, not sure she'd heard him correctly. Your approach, Professor Harmon continued, using that variable transformation and the modified eigenfunction method, it's unorthodox, but it works. I've verified your results. You've solved a problem that I've been working on for years. I've been thinking about similar problems for a while, May said, finding her voice. My second paper proposed a theoretical framework that, yes, I know, Professor Harmon interrupted. I've read your papers now, both of them. Dr. Wright was kind enough to point them out to me. He leaned back in his chair, which leads me to the question I've been asking myself since I read your exam. Why did you hide your abilities in my class for so long? The question caught May off guard. She considered it carefully before answering. I wasn't hiding exactly, she said slowly. I've never been comfortable standing out. When you started calling on me expecting me to fail, it was easier to give you the simple answers you wanted than to show what I could really do. Professor Harmon's expression shifted, something like regret flickering across his face. I misjudged you, Ms. Lin, significantly. He stood up and walked to his bookshelf, selecting a volume and returning to his desk. I owe you an apology. My behavior was unprofessional and, frankly, beneath the standards of this university. May sat very still, not sure how to respond to this unexpected turn. Dr. Wright has suggested, and I agree, that your talents would be wasted in an ordinary graduate program. He pushed a pamphlet across the desk toward her. We'd like to offer you a place in our advanced research track, working directly with faculty on original mathematics. He stared at the pamphlet, then back at Professor Harmon. You want me to join your research group? If you're willing to work with me after how I've treated you, he said, a hint of humility in his voice. Your approach to the Kirchhoff-Ramsey problem opens up possibilities I hadn't considered. Together we could develop it into a significant publication. I don't know what to say. You don't need to decide immediately, Professor Harmon assured her. Think about it. Talk to Dr. Wright. Consider your options. He hesitated, then added, and know that, regardless of your decision, you have earned my respect, not that you needed it. As May left his office, clutching the research program pamphlet, she felt as though she were walking in a dream. Outside, the campus was bathed in golden afternoon light. Students crossed the quad, laughing and talking. Life continued as normal, but everything had changed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. How did it go with Harmon? May smiled and typed back. He offered me a spot in the advanced research program, and an apology. The reply came seconds. Later, what? We need details. Coffee shop in 15 minutes. As she walked toward the coffee shop where her friends would be waiting, May thought about the journey that had brought her here. From the quiet girl hiding in the back row to a mathematician with a voice and a future. Professor Harmon had tried to humiliate her, not knowing who she really was. In the end, they had both learned something important, that brilliance comes in many forms, and sometimes the quietest voice has the most profound things to say. May looked up at the clear blue sky and took a deep breath. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She was ready to sow.